Welcome to the program, everyone, and really pleased to have joining me today, Mr. Michael Adams from Melbourne in Australia, who's a sales storytelling expert, and I'd say is maybe the sales storytelling expert. So Mike, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Steve. Delighted to be here.
Good, good. So Mike, really want to get into, last time we talked about storytelling, and you've got a whole structure and you've got that fantastic book, 7 Stories Every Salesperson Must Tell. Is that it?
That's it. Perfect.
That's the one. And we went across the whole sales storytelling structure, which was awesome. Got a fantastic response. Today we're going to talk about story listening.
That's it.
And tell us a bit about what that's about and why you started thinking about story listening.
Yeah. Maybe we just focus on the problem that we're trying to solve.
Oh, sure.
It relates directly to my personal story of my career. I'm an electrical engineer by training, and I got into sales by accident, like probably almost every salesperson out there. You know, I always have this sort of image of little kids on the mat in primary school, and no one put their hand up to say they wanted to be a salesperson, you know, when they were doing that. But we ended up in this job, and we love it. But it wasn't what we thought we were going to do. And when you've got a technical training like I have a very analytical approach to what works and what doesn't work. And I fell into storytelling by accident a long time ago, 20 years ago, when I was working in Russia, and I happened to tell a story that I thought was a good story. You know, it was a story about my company. It was actually our company story and what had happened to us in Russia, because our company had been working in Russia in the 1930s and had been nationalized by Stalin and kicked out of the country. And in fact, even the country manager was executed. So, you know, like total disaster in Russia. And then they had to make this decision. Do they come back into work in Russia? And they did, and they invested heavily in a couple of Russian oil companies and doubled their production. And today the business for Schlumberger, the company I was working for, massive oil services company, is, you know, in the billions in Russia. But I was telling the history, and because the Russians didn't know about our company at all when we went in there, when I was there in the year 2000. And I told it because I thought it was an interesting story, but I started to hear the story back from other clients, like it was traveling. The story was traveling. Yes. And that's when I got really curious about, oh, that's interesting. You're like, you can tell a story and people will tell it again. And then I started being much more purposeful about the stories that I tell. And I got interested in another real problem that sales managers have. I was running pretty big sales teams across telecoms and oil and gas. We're selling software. And the real issue I had was that most of my salespeople couldn't really hold a high-level business conversation with their clients. And there's a lot of books that try to teach how to have the conversation, and they mostly fail, I think, because they focus on one angle of the conversation, which is questions, what questions you should ask. And then they don't really explain how to really have the conversation. And what I hit upon was teaching a story to tell early in a conversation with a client so that the client would tell a story back to me. It's really an idea of story sharing, not teaching storytelling so much for the purpose of tell a story because it will do something. It will do something, but to get into a deeper conversation. And conversation depth is an interesting thing. And I'll explain what I mean by conversation depth. 99%, I would say, of business conversation is high-level conceptual. We say things like customer service is critically important. You know, we have this sort of abstract way of talking in business. It's our culture. It's actually the business culture is abstract. So you know, our software is differentiated by being cloud-based. It's a platform structure. You know, we have this sort of very, very abstract way of talking. If we're talking with people that really understand our business and our industry, they know what we mean. But when we're salespeople and we're talking with clients, they usually don't know what they mean. They don't want to say they don't know what we mean, but they kind of go along.
It could mean a lot of things though too. Those sort of descriptions.
Yeah, that's right. So when we
it's a bit
talk,
bland, isn't it?
yeah, it is. When we talk in an abstract way, which is kind of that's our culture. That's how we talk in business. People don't know what we mean. Now, when we talk as a narrative, and by narrative, I mean when we say this happened, and because of that, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, we can picture that. We can go, okay, yeah, I get that. This is happening, this is happening, this is happening. But when we go even one level deeper and just describe a moment in time so that we could picture ourselves there, then we can really get it. So I'll give you an example. So you're talking with a client and they say, look, customer service is just critical for us. Now, that's high level.
Okay.
You know, that's high level, and everyone agrees with that. And most people would just let that pass, right? Of course, it's critical. But if I say to you, oh, that's interesting, Steve, could you give me an example of great customer service that you've seen this year? You know, what happened? That's a story-seeking question. That's a question that goes down to, give me a for instance. And then you start to listen to what happened. And all you need to do at that point as the story listener is to just go, oh, where was that exactly? And who was there? And then what happened? And what happened because of that? And you start to get this little anecdote about great customer service. You know, oh, we had this guy and the client was really angry and he was on the phone. I could see he was just about to hang up, but he persevered. And suddenly we had a breakthrough. We realized that we had completely failed to understand what was going on. And because of that customer call, that service agent allowed us to make a complete change to our system, you know, and it was, it was a brilliant piece of customer service where our guy had emotional intelligence, you know. So you're getting down to like details of what good customer service means or bad customer service. Could you tell me when it doesn't work, what it's like? So you and I both talk with sales leaders, and sales leaders, you know, I was in a call not so long ago, you know, and I got an opinion, high level opinion. My guys don't prepare well for sales calls. You know, they just don't prepare. Now that's a statement, that's an opinion that I agree with, because my sales guys didn't prepare either. They're hardly prepared for any of them, I would say.
Right.
So I could just agree, or I could go down to the narrative level, to the story level, and say, when was the last time you saw that happen? Where were you when you saw that happen last time? What happened exactly? And then you get the story. And I'll give you an example from a recent client. This happened. It's happened in the discovery process, and so this is a lady running an insurance industry, actually. So she's running all the marketing and all of the sales teams for a very large, one of the global biggest insurance companies in the world. And I'm asking her, because she has mentioned that she thinks they need storytelling. And I know that nobody buys storytelling for storytelling. They buy it to solve a problem. I want to know what's the problem. So I said, well, what was it that made you think? Where were you then you realized that storytelling was something that you needed? Tell what happened. And that's a story-seeking question. And she said, well, I recently come into this company. I've been working for one of the major competitors, one of the other really big companies. I'd moved into, actually in Hong Kong, moved into Hong Kong, and I wanted to get to know all the people that work for me, all the salespeople. So I set up an event, and we got every salesperson presenting to me about their accounts. For a typical thing for a sales leader. I don't want to hear all the account plans.
Sit in a room all day.
Exactly. And she said, as each one went in, my heart just sank, because they were talking brochures, you know, that they were so uninteresting and so technical that I realized, you know, I've got this new job and I'm going to fail, right? If I can't change the way they talk, if they talk like that to their clients, I'm sunk. So it was this desire to change the nature of the conversation that the salespeople have, to get them to have this deeper level of conversation.
Yes.
And it's not only that they can pass critical information in a way that you would like to hear it in a story, but they can get that critical information back. They can have that deeper conversation, because if I share with you a real example of what my problem is, I really feel like you understand my problem much better, rather than if I just tell you the high level. Tender documents are written in high level, right? Tender documents have this, this is this high level problem statement. That's the way. But knowing what is the story underneath makes a massive difference. I'll pause there because I'm curious in your opinion, and then I'll tell you a story of when story listening won me a huge deal, because I think this actually comes to all of the points of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Mike, it makes a lot of sense to me if I think about, in a parallel world in journalism or news.
Yes.
Right. The good journalist or the poor journalist will talk about statistics about something that's happening.
Generalizing.
Say some big tragedy, 10,000 people lost their houses in a hurricane.
Yes.
But the really good journalist finds one person that suffered that disaster and tells their story. And we all know how powerful that is, right?
Correct. In fact, we need to be careful that we don't draw the wrong generalization from stories. A good journalism is a good example. Another good example that most of your listeners probably would know is the author Malcolm Gladwell. He wrote Blink and David and Goliath, and a lot of very popular books on psychology, I would say, really. And every chapter starts with a story, and then he draws his generalizations from the story.
Oh, okay, yes.
And by doing it that way around, we work the way our brains work. Our brains are really interested in what happens next. We have these brains that want to kind of predict what's happening next. And we like this sequence. We like our information coming to us in that story format. This has happened. Oh, I don't know what's going to happen. What goes next? That's very interesting for our brains. And then we upscale to the general. So if we can have that kind of client conversation where we go deep on specific instances of problems, and then we understand the client's problem, they understand that we understand. They also get to understand the way we solve the problem, because we'll tell them not just we solve the problem generally, this. We'll tell a success story of another client, and we'll go deep on the details of a story about how we solve that problem. So we're using our story to help them understand in detail how we solve the problem. And they're telling us their story so that we can understand. And that's problem solving. Problem solving is both of us understanding so that we can both apply our minds to the solution.
Yeah.
I'll give you a quick example from
go ahead.
Most of my career, I worked as the same as you, Steve, with technology, telecommunications and software. But I had a short stint in the facility services industry, which is very interesting. We were selling cooking, catering, cleaning services to big mining companies. The contracts were actually very big. And I went to meet the head of one of the world's largest mining companies in Perth. People might guess, we have a couple over there. And this guy was in charge of all of the accommodation, airports, towns, camps for a huge mining area in Western Australia in the Pilbara. And he had an asset base of about $3 billion worth of stuff that he was responsible for. And I was interested in winning some business to run a camp that was coming up for tender. Okay. And we got to talking about safety. I actually shared a personal story about safety of mine from the oil and gas, because mining companies are very interested in safety. And he said something high level. He said, safety is critically important for this tender. I could have left it because it always is in mining, right? That's like kind of high level general, always true. But I asked that question. I said, could you give me an example of
I think it's good, just on that point, Mike, because if we have a good safety story on our side, we might be tempted to tell him all about how good we are at safety.
True.
Which would be a mistake as well.
Well, it's okay to put into a story, not the generalizations about how we are, but if we could tell a little story about how we solved the safety.
But I like your approach. It's PhD level for me. Let's find out what he means by safety.
That's right.
First, before we even talk about how
I actually phrased it the opposite way. I phrased it, what is it you don't, give me an example of what you don't want. Help me understand what you don't want. This was the magic way to ask the question, because he told me that on one of their camps, so these camps have like anywhere between 1,000 and 3,000 people on them at any one time.
Yeah.
Both the mining company exec in charge of the camp and the contract manager of the vendor who was doing all of the maintenance and services for the camp, they were both incentivized in their bonuses to avoid accidents. And guess what happens when two humans get together and they have a financial incentive to avoid accidents? They colluded to hide accidents, right?
Right. They're not reporting.
And they got caught.
Yep.
Of course they got caught. And the mining company execs got fired, and the vendor company got kicked off the contract, which was actually the reason that the tender was out.
Wow.
Don't tell me this wasn't important information, right? And
you wouldn't have guessed at that. There's no way you could guess at that. That's by safety.
Precisely. So, but what I found was we'd already made a first offer for this tender. And I realized as I read our bid, and I was very new to the industry, I didn't know, but I realized that we had not really, the tender was typical tender, right? So it had, these are our 4 KPIs, and one of them was safety. And we had kind of done this generic response, and we had not answered the safety questions. We'd done a good job on the other stuff, and we were the least expensive. And I went back to our guys and said, look, we haven't answered all this stuff. We've got to put in specific stuff around safety. In fact, we need this, this, this. And the company I was working for said, well, we can't, because there's no margin in this. We can't add in more into this tender. So I only had one meeting with the guy, but I had a good enough rapport to ring him up after hours and say, here's my problem. And he told me, you need to put your price up. That's the only time in my entire career where the buyer told me to put the price up in a request for tender. And we did. That was a difficult persuasion job for me back in my new company, to explain it got to go up. We've got to pad it enough to cost in the additional safety measures. We won that contract, and it was 35 million, just over $30 million per year. It's still running since 2012.
Nice.
So, talking about a contract worth a few $100 million, right? And I believe it was won by hearing a story. The story made the difference. If I hadn't heard that story, I would not have gone to that effort.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mike, at the start, you mentioned sales reps struggling to have high-level conversations, right? And this is a way to overcome that. So what happens if we don't address this?
Yeah.
What sort of conversations do salespeople have with?
What happens is that the clients don't trust the salesperson to open up and tell them what's really going on. Mm-hmm. So they have this high-level conversation. The salesperson is irritating in their generalizations about how great their company is and how great their product is. The buyer tries to glean something from that, but all the salespeople are like that. So the buyer does something with that information, and they make a decision on what to buy. But the salesperson that can go deep and really understand what's going on, be trusted. So what happens when I tell my story, which is what happened with that mining company, I told my story and it had a safety aspect, and the client decided to trust me. Because you don't tell a story like that one, now you may notice I'm not saying the name of the company, right? Because it's obviously confidential. You don't tell a story like that unless you're trusting that this other person is someone that's worth sharing the story with, right? So that's like the first problem with salespeople. But now we're really going deep on the problem, because this guy is going to lose his job if he doesn't solve this problem. So now I really understand how important this problem is to him, right? So we have a connection at the level of the problem and how we're solving the problem. And because he really does trust me enough to take a late night phone call about how we've got to put the price up, he's also, of course, as you know well, coaching me how to win this deal.
Yeah,
because he wants me to win that deal, right? So all the way through that buying of, should I trust this guy? Will I really share what the problem is? Or will I just put out this high level view of the problem and do all the back end myself?
Yes.
Will I get the solution provider that I really want? All of that is actually solved by the stories. The story is just a tool. The story is a tool to get trust and to go deep in the conversation by hearing the story.
Something I'm picking up here is we're using stories at various stages of the sales process here.
Yes.
About using in the beginning to establish trust,
correct,
credibility. Then you gave some example where you're using it in discovery
to go deep in the discovery.
Yeah, and then you're talking about, the problem you had in your company. That's sort of a bit.
I had to tell that story back into my company because that's very common for salespeople, isn't it? You need to get your company acting on behalf of your client to provide the right solution. Look, when you work for really big companies, I work for German multinational Siemens. That is 3/4 of the problem is persuading Siemens that they should bid on this thing and provide,
because I've had a lot of experience where, I've been, trying to win some huge contract with a big complex customer, and you go internally to get support, and senior management, they get excited when you tell the story and you get them involved.
That's right.
In it, right?
That's right.
Whereas if you just go back and say, "Oh, I need a discount for this size of deal or something," right? It doesn't have the same.
That's right. If I need a discount, then you've immediately taken the conversation to the financial level for your people. And then they go, okay, what's the return on investment? What's the payback? And you're having this conversation you don't really want to have. You want them to want to win the deal, right? So you want them to want to solve the client's problem.
Yes.
To do that, you need to tell the story of the client's problem, which is what I did in that facility services example.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's solving the stories are solving complex problems through the buying process and the selling process. The very real problem of how to get close enough to a client that they trust us, because you tell a story that they find interesting and that they want to reciprocate. The magical thing about stories is if I tell you a story, you want to tell me one back. So that's how it works. And then the problem of how do I problem solve? How do I learn enough about the client's problem that I can really help them? Well, I have to hear their stories. I have to hear in detail, not in high level tender speak. I need to hear in detail what's going on so that I understand and they understand, I understand. And then they can hear my stories to understand that, yep, we can solve that kind of problem. And then I've got the final problem of getting through all of the politics of getting a decision made. And then I need to be coached, and I'll be coached by the client that really trusts me. I think, all of these I never want a deal worth more than a couple of $1 million that I wasn't coached all the way to the end on what to do next.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the one part of the sales process, just to sort of complete this a bit, is stories that help us close deals.
Yes.
And I know you've got some thoughts on that. So we've sort of gone all the way through the process. So how do we work with our coach? I guess we want to help them close the deal, right?
Yes, there's an old saying in sales management, and when I wrote 7 Stories, I tried to research. I wanted to see if I could find the origin of this saying, and I failed. So if any of your listeners know, then please send me a note. And the saying is this: you need to teach your buyer how to buy, and you need to teach them how to sell. There's the second part that's very interesting when it comes to contract negotiation. So teaching your client how to buy at the surface level means, what are the aspects that you should know about when you're buying this kind of service? What should you know about? How should you compare us to our competitors? And we often do this as salespeople, right? So we're positioning ourselves and explaining, if you're going to buy this, this is important.
Sure.
Teaching your buyer how to sell is what happens. So that buyer knows how to buy and they like your solution, but they need to persuade internally in their company that you're the right thing. So they need to know how to sell. So you need to arm them with stories that will help them sell. So it's no good them just going into the stakeholder meeting and saying, we've got to have these guys because I like them. They've got to know how to argue for you. Yes. And there are all kinds of different problems that happen in stakeholder meetings. But if you have a good communication with that person, if they're a coach, and if they tell you what the problem is, and you're someone who knows how to buy your services, you can coach them. And I'll give you a quick example, which I wrote about in 7 Stories. I was working on this is back in the mid-2000s, before iPod. So before there was common music download to a device and then to a phone, the company I was working for, a big multinational telecoms company, media and telecoms company, they had a music download platform that just about worked on a 2G phone. It was a lot better on a 3G phone, but it just about worked on a 2G phone. And we were trying to sell it to a big telco company, and it was going to be a revenue share. So we were going to make money out of the songs that were downloaded, and they were, and we had a very good relationship with the technical team. There were a lot of technical problems to solve, and we had a pretty nice business model. And then it got down to signing the contract, and then it became very adversarial. I remember we were at the top floor in the headquarters here in Melbourne, and they brought in this like chief negotiator guy that sat at the head of a long, narrow table. So we had all the client guys on one side, all the technical people that I knew very well now because I've been working with them for months, and all our people on the other side. And this guy was a complete arsehole. You know, I mean, there's just no other word for him. He was just, all he wanted to do was tear the total agreement apart, you know, and he demanded like ridiculous quality levels, and the price wasn't going to work, and very, very combative.
Yes.
And I came away from the first meeting, and I must have had this sort of long look on my face as I went into the office. And one of the really senior sales guys said to me, "Mike, what's wrong?" And I explained the situation, and he said, "Why don't you just go and have a chat with him?" And like that idea had not even just crossed my mind at all as a possibility, because this guy was a really kind of high status wheeler dealer, their chief negotiator, right? And he was intimidating. And I thought, well, what's to lose? You know, there's no way we can negotiate at the point that he's come at, you know, there's non-negotiable. So I rang him up, and he agreed to meet me, and we spent nearly 2 hours, and I went through all of why the deal is. He had no idea what he was negotiating. And we came back into the next meeting, and he didn't skip a beat. He was exactly the same arsehole, right? But he just skirted around every non-negotiable aspect of the deal.
Okay.
We got the deal done, right?
Right.
So my colleague taught me how to teach the client how to, you know, basically I needed to sell to that guy, right? This is what you can do in a stakeholder situation. So your coach says, "I'm having a big problem with the CFO." You tell him that little story and go, "Well, look, this is what happened to me, or this is what happened to Mike. Why don't you get the guy on his own and find out what his real concerns are," right? So you're teaching your coach, your sponsor, how to sell. You're teaching them how to sell.
Right.
They want to buy, but you're teaching them how to sell. And you can use stories to do that. I have many examples of stories that, if you get...
I think it's a problem, Mike, because and you've got a good solution. We all know the buying committee is expanding year after year after year. We're seeing surveys, and we'd love to get in front of them all, but often we can't. So we're relying on this
it's impossible,
or the coach to carry our message. And maybe they're going to put up on a PowerPoint, "Oh, here's the 3 solutions from the 3 vendors," and it's all like facts and figures and numbers, and you can probably throw a blanket over them, right? You could choose any one. They probably can all solve the problem, right? So I'm guessing if we can arm our coach with a great story about that will just add on to our side of the ledger.
That's right.
Over the edge.
And not just a story, but what we're doing actually is we're coaching our coach.
Okay.
We're using stories to coach our coach. So our coach has coached us to get to they want us to win. I never want to deal where the client didn't want me to win.
Sure.
They want us to win. And now I'm acting as a sales manager to my coach by feeding them with stories to teach them how to behave to win, because the buyer is often not trained in selling at all. They don't know how to sell.
Yeah.
That's what they need your help with.
I think this is good, because even when we have the support of the coach, sometimes we lose the deal.
True. We lose the deal because the coach wasn't up to the job.
They come back and say, "Oh, the committee decided not to do anything."
Yeah, they wanted to buy you, but you were too expensive. Well, you know, the coach failed to sell you. They failed to sell your solution in that situation. And what you said is 100% true, Steve. You cannot get to meet all those people. I mean, theoretically, you know, in theory, people will say, you know, it's the salesperson's job to get around and meet everybody in the stakeholder committee. This is practically impossible.
Yeah.
Firstly, these stakeholder committees form quite late, actually. You know, they form after solution evaluation, right? They're actually risk committees. What they really are is risk committees. So once we've decided we've got a need, Then we've analyzed a solution, and then the risk committee gets together. You know, is this going to sink our company? Can we afford it? Is it the right project? Is it safe? Is it compliant? Is it financial? All these other people come in, and really you need to get your coach selling to those people.
Yeah,
you just can't meet them.
Yeah.
It's a nice theory that you should meet them, practically impossible.
All right, Mike, we're coming up to the end of our time. So do you have some final thoughts or anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to share here?
Yeah, I'll say a little bit about how the success we're having getting salespeople to have these kind of conversations, because as you know, Steve, it's not an easy thing to change conversation habits. They're very ingrained in us, the ways that we speak. And it's the same for me, and I'm sure it's the same for you. So we teach people storytelling and get them to tell certain types of stories. So we teach them success stories and personal stories. Those are the two big ones for salespeople. But then we put them into activities where we teach them to ask these story listening questions. And I found a very interesting way to do it, and it's around objections. So salespeople love objections. Well, they love to talk about them. They don't like to receive them, right? But it's a very popular topic. What do I say if the client objects to this, 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 and this? And an objection is an opportunity to go deep.
I agree.
Now, we are trained to kind of, if not push back about, but to manage, to control objections.
Use
right?
them or something.
And even anecdote, we also teach a story technique with objections, which is to acknowledge the client's concern, but then tell a story about when that is not true. But that's still a kind of a pushback approach at its heart. But if you had asked the question, could you give me an example of where you've experienced that problem? You know, you're objecting, our software is too difficult to use. Tell me when that's happened to you, when it's been too difficult. And you're really starting to understand that problem, going deep on the objection instead of pushing back on the objection.
Yes.
It's a really good way to practice. And that's where I've had a lot of success recently with exercises around objections and using them as story listening opportunities.
Yes.
So yeah, I'll leave your listeners with that as a thought about how to change salespeople.
Absolutely. Hey, Mike, give us 1 minute on what Anecdote's doing and the program for sales organizations.
Sure. Anecdote is, so this is the give you one that's not correct. This is the program that we run. It's called Story Powered Sales.
Yep.
It runs over a few weeks. Actually, the coronavirus has made it run more effectively. We run a couple of hours of workshops, and then we coach stories. We do that individually. And then we run a little fake competition where we're getting the sales teams to pitch using storytelling, and we capture those stories for their story bank. So that's roughly how the program works. Has the story listening exercises in it. Anecdote is one of the world's most established storytelling companies, but interestingly, they started in 2004 as a story listening company, not a storytelling company. So when Sean Callahan started Anecdote, he was collecting stories for culture change. So seeking stories to find out how do people really behave so that senior leaders could develop change programs, culture change programs.
Wow.
And then the clients came to him and said, you seem to know a lot about storytelling. Would you teach our people storytelling? And Sean's like, no, I'm not doing that. That's too open to manipulation, you know. But eventually they did. And the condition that they agreed to bring out this program, which is their first one, Storytelling for Leaders, was on the condition that we only tell true anecdotes from their business life. We're not Hollywood. We're not trying to do dramatic fables or fairy tales or stories. We're looking for actual things that happened. And that's what I've been talking about as well. Actual stories about things that happened is what you want. And they're true stories.
Yeah.
We only tell true stories, and we seek out the real true stories of the client. Yeah. So that's what we do.
That's awesome, Mike. Really powerful tool for salespeople. And I think it can really help overcome a lot of challenges sales folks have and sales teams have. So Mike, thanks very much. Got a lot out of that. I'm sure the whole audience did too. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, thank you.
And thanks everyone for listening and watching, and look forward to engaging with you more. Bye for now. Take care.